In 1324, one man crossed the desert with so much gold that he destroyed the economy of 3 continents. Cairo, the year 1324, the richest city in the Islamic world, the center of trade between Africa, Asia, and Europe, a metropolis of perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, at a time when London had fewer than 80,000. And then he arrived. He didn't arrive alone. He arrived with 60,000 people, 12,000 slaves, each carrying 4 kilograms of pure gold, 80 camels, each transporting 135 kilograms of gold dust, hundreds of horses, thousands of soldiers, physicians, scribes, imams, architects, musicians, cooks, an entire city in motion across the desert. And when he arrived in Cairo, when this man sat before the Sultan of Egypt, what happened in the weeks that followed would shake the economy of the Mediterranean world for more than a decade. The gold he distributed, as gifts, as alms, as casual payment for services, was so vast that the price of gold in Cairo collapsed. It didn't fall a little, it collapsed by 25%. And it took 12 years to recover. One man, one journey, one casual demonstration of wealth, and the economies of 3 continents entered crisis. His name was Mansa Musa. He was the emperor of Mali, an empire in the heart of West Africa that most people have never heard of. And he was, in inflation-adjusted terms, the richest man who ever existed in the history of humanity. Richer than Jeff Bezos, richer than Elon Musk, richer than all the world's billionaires combined. His wealth in current values is estimated at $400 billion. 400 billion. And yet, until recently, his name barely appeared in history books. How is this possible? And what else was erased along with him? To understand Mansa Musa, we first need to destroy a lie that was told for centuries, that was taught in schools, that shaped the way the world sees the African continent. The lie that Africa, before the arrival of Europeans, was a continent without history, without cities, without civilization. It is one of the greatest falsehoods of modern historiography. And the facts to refute it exist, documented, archaeologically verified, written in tens of thousands of manuscripts that still survive today. Before speaking of Mansa Musa, we need to speak of what existed before him, because the Mali Empire didn't emerge from nothing. It emerged from an Africa that already had centuries of complex civilization. The Empire of Ghana. Before Mali, there was Ghana, not the modern country, but an empire that controlled the gold and salt trade in West Africa for centuries. From approximately 300 AD to 1100 AD, 700 years of existence. For context, the Western Roman Empire lasted less than 500 years. The Empire of Ghana was administered with a sophistication that surprises historians. It had a judicial system. It had a bureaucracy. It had professional armies. It had trade routes extending from the Mediterranean to the heart of Africa. The Arab geographer al-Bakri, writing in 1068, described the court of Ghana's king in extraordinary detail. A palace with painted wooden columns, the king seated on a golden throne, surrounded by horses with gold bridles, princes to his right with gold braids, governors to his left with gold turbans. This was not a primitive tribe. This was an imperial court. Gold and salt. Here is something that history books rarely explain adequately. In the Middle Ages, there were 2 substances more valuable than almost anything else in the world: gold and salt. Gold because it was the basis of the monetary system. Salt because, before refrigeration, it was the only way to preserve food. Literally the difference between eating and starving in winter. And West Africa had both. The gold mines of Bambouk and Bure produced more than half the gold circulating in the medieval Mediterranean world. It is estimated that between the 8th and 14th centuries, West Africa supplied 2/3 of all the world's gold. 2/3. When medieval Europe used gold coins, when Venetian merchants weighed gold in their markets, when popes financed the Crusades with gold, when European kings paid their armies with gold, that gold came largely from West Africa, through trans-Saharan routes, through Arab merchants who served as intermediaries, through a trading system that functioned with extraordinary efficiency for centuries. And the salt mines of the Sahara, especially those of Tagaza, produced salt that was worth literally its weight in gold. There were accounts, confirmed by Arab travelers, that on the desert frontiers, trade was conducted in silence. Northern merchants left their goods in a pile. Southern merchants came, inspected, and left an equivalent pile of gold. The first returned, and if the exchange seemed fair, they took the gold. No common language, no direct contact. Just the silent game of supply and demand. And this system worked for centuries. Other African empires, Ghana and Mali, were not alone. At the same time that Mali flourished in the west, the Kingdom of Congo was growing in Central Africa. Great Zimbabwe was raising its enormous stone walls without mortar in the south. The Aksumite Empire already had centuries of history in East Africa. Great Zimbabwe, whose name means House of Stone in Shona, is a complex of granite structures built without mortar, without cement, using only carefully fitted stones. The walls are in some places more than 10 meters high and 5 meters thick. When European archaeologists discovered the ruins in the 19th century, the initial reaction was extraordinary in its dishonesty. Colonial scholars proposed that the ruins had been built by Phoenicians, by Arabs, by any other civilization other than African. Because the idea that Africans could have built something so impressive contradicted everything that colonialism needed to believe in order to justify itself. Today, archaeology is clear. Great Zimbabwe was built by the Shona people between the 11th and 15th centuries. It is one of the largest and most impressive monuments in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is almost completely unknown to the general public. What the Arabs recorded. Here is something rarely mentioned in discussions of African history. Medieval Arab historians and geographers extensively documented the civilizations of West Africa. Ibn Battuta, al-Bakri, Ibn Khaldun, al-Masudi. These were the best historians and geographers of the medieval world, and they wrote about West Africa, not as a land of primitives, but as a region of prosperous cities, sophisticated rulers, and active international trade. Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in 1352, was so impressed by the order and justice of the empire that he wrote that its inhabitants rarely commit injustices, for the Sultan never forgives one who commits injustice. This was not the view of a barbaric civilization. It was the admiration of a sophisticated traveler for a society he considered well organized. Ibn Khaldun, considered one of the founders of modern sociology and historiography, wrote extensively about Mali and its emperors. His Muqaddimah, written in 1377, is one of the most important works of medieval historiography and devotes significant pages to West African civilizations. This history exists. It is written. It is documented. It was deliberately erased during the centuries of colonialism, when it was more convenient to present Africa as a continent without history to justify exploitation. And Mansa Musa was one of the first victims of that erasure. The Mali Empire did not begin as an empire. It began as a humiliation. In the 11th century, the Mandinka people, the people who had found Mali, were subservient vassals of the empire of Sosso, which had itself destroyed the ancient empire of Ghana. The Mandinka paid tributes. They were humiliated. They were dominated. And then a figure emerged that the oral tradition of Mali has preserved for centuries with a clarity that rivals any Greek or Norse epic. Sundiata Keita, the Lion of Mali. The story of Sundiata is extraordinary. He was born in a small, subservient kingdom. He spent his childhood with a physical disability, unable to walk according to tradition. He was an object of mockery. Even his mother suffered humiliations for having given the king a son who was incapable. And then, according to tradition, at 7 years old, Sundiata stood up. Literally. He used an iron bar to support himself and slowly, with superhuman effort, stood upright for the first time. It is a story that resonates in all human cultures. The hero who overcomes physical weakness to become the greatest warrior of his generation. When King Sumanguru Kante of the Empire of Sosso began to expand his domain with increasing brutality, destroying kingdoms, killing chiefs, humiliating peoples, exiles and refugees began to seek out Sundiata. Who was in exile, at a foreign court, growing in strength and skill. In 1235, at the Battle of Kyrene, one of the most decisive moments in medieval African history, Sundiata defeated Sumanguru Kante. The details of the battle were preserved in the oral tradition of the griots, the professional singers and historians of Mali who memorize and transmit history from generation to generation. According to that tradition, the battle was decided by an extraordinary detail. Sumanguru Kante was considered nearly invincible because of his supernatural powers. And the only material that could wound him was a white rooster's spur. Sundiata, informed by spies, prepared an arrow tipped with a white rooster's spur. When it struck Sumanguru, even if it was not fatal, it broke the spell that protected him, and the invincible warrior fled the battlefield. The story may be allegorical, a way of expressing that Sundiata found Sumanguru's weakness, whatever it was. But the result is not allegorical. Sumanguru was defeated. The empire of Sosso was dismantled, and the Mali Empire was born. What happened next is extraordinary. Rather than simply replacing one tyrant with another, Sundiata created something new. He summoned the chiefs of the peoples who had fought alongside him and established a pact, a kind of constitution, called the Manden Charter, or Kurukan Fuga. The Manden Charter. Here is what is extraordinary about this document. The Manden Charter, established in 1235, included provisions that anticipate the most advanced principles of modern international law: the abolition of slavery on grounds of race or ethnicity. People could be enslaved through debt or capture in war, as was common throughout the medieval world, but not because of their ethnic origin, the inviolability of human life. No person could be killed without trial. Freedom of expression. People had the right to speak freely, as long as they respected established authorities. Freedom of trade. No merchant could be prevented from trading. The protection of women. Specifically, violence against women was prohibited. The right to food. No person should go hungry while the empire had resources to feed them. And solidarity among the different peoples of the empire. The obligation to help each other in times of need. 750 years before the Declaration of the Rights of Man of the French Revolution in 1789. 550 years before the American Declaration of Independence in 1776. The UNESCO recognized the Manden Charter as one of the earliest human rights documents in history. It was inscribed on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2009, and almost nobody knows it exists. When people speak of the foundations of modern human rights, they speak of Locke, of Rousseau, of Jefferson. Rarely is Sundiata Keita and the Manden Charter mentioned, because the history we learned was written by people who had an interest in keeping Africa out of the narrative of human civilizational progress. The growth of the empire. Under Sundiata and his successors, the Mali Empire grew in an extraordinary way. It controlled a territory the size of Western Europe, from the Atlantic to the Niger River, from the coastal forests to the Sahara Desert. With an estimated population of 40 to 50 million people, when Europe, still recovering from the Black Death, had perhaps 35 million, it controlled the gold and salt trade routes. It controlled the river ports of the Niger. It controlled the market cities linking the trans-Saharan trade to the heart of Africa. It was one of the largest and richest empires in the medieval world, and it was in this context, in this vast and prosperous empire, that Mansa Musa ascended to the throne. Mansa Musa ascended to the throne of Mali in 1312, but the way he came to power is in itself an extraordinary story. The previous emperor, Mansa Abu Bakr II, had an obsession. He wanted to know what lay on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. This was not a completely crazy idea for the time. Mali's sailors regularly navigated along the African coast. They knew the currents, the winds, the stars. And Abu Bakr II decided to send an expedition to discover what lay beyond the horizon. He sent 2,000 canoes, with provisions for 2 years, with orders never to return without having found the other side, or without having exhausted their supplies. The expedition departed. It never returned. Abu Bakr II then sent a second expedition, this time even larger. 2,000 war canoes and 1,000 supply canoes. 3,000 vessels in total. And this time Abu Bakr Send went personally. He appointed Musa, a nephew of Sundiata, through a complicated line of lineage, as regent during his absence. And he departed. He never returned. Nobody knows what happened to Abu Bakr the Send's expedition. Some historians believe they were caught by North Atlantic currents and perished. Others, and this is a theory that has gained some academic support, believe they reached the Americas. That Abu Bakr the Send's vessels touched the soil of the New World 180 years before Columbus. There is controversial archaeological evidence in Central America of pre-Columbian contact with African populations. There are accounts by Spanish chroniclers of encounters with dark-skinned populations on the coasts of the Americas. It is not certain, but it is also not impossible. What is certain is that Abu Bakr II disappeared into the Atlantic in 1311, and Musa became Mansa Musa. Mansa meaning King of Kings, the lord of one of the greatest empires on earth. The character of an emperor. What we know about the character of Mansa Musa comes from diverse sources: Arab chroniclers, Egyptian records, the oral tradition of Mali, and the account of Musa himself to the historian Al-Umari, who interviewed him in Cairo. And the portrait that emerges is fascinating. Mansa Musa was a deeply religious man, a devout Muslim, who prayed 5 times a day, who fasted during Ramadan, who considered the pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, a religious obligation he must fulfill. He was also a brilliant administrator. He kept cohesive an empire of 40 to 50 million people through a system of provincial governors, efficient communication routes, and a judicial system that functioned. The governance of Mansa Musa. Here is something that contemporary accounts make clear. Mansa Musa was not merely rich. He was an effective ruler. The Mali Empire under his reign was organized in a way that rivals any medieval system of government. There was a central administration based in the capital, probably Niani, though the exact location is still debated by archaeologists. There were provincial governors, called farins, who administered the different regions of the empire in the name of the Mansa. There was a judicial system based on Islamic law, the Sharia, but integrated with local Mandinka legal traditions in a way that created a functionally effective hybrid system. There were communication routes, horse-mounted messengers who carried orders and information between the capital and the provinces. And there was an army estimated at tens of thousands of soldiers that maintained order and protected the trade routes. Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali under Mansa Musa's son, was impressed by the security on the roads. Travelers have nothing to fear, neither from thieves nor from the violent. For a man accustomed to traveling through the medieval world, where roadside robbery was common and law was frequently a fiction, this was extraordinary. The economic system. The Mali Empire had a sophisticated economic system that went far beyond the simple extraction of gold. There was a system of trade taxes. Every caravan that crossed Mali territory paid tributes. Every market operating in Mali cities paid fees. There was control over the gold mines. The Mansa was the formal owner of all gold nuggets found in the empire. Gold dust could be sold freely, but nuggets, the larger and more valuable forms, belonged to the state. This system ensured that the Mansa always maintained reserves of physical gold, while dust trade fed the economy. It was medieval monetary policy, rudimentary by our standards, but effective in its result. The pilgrimage he planned for 1324 was not just a religious duty, it was a declaration to the world. See who we are, see what we have, see our greatness. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is one of the most extraordinary events in medieval history, and it is almost completely unknown to the Western public. The preparation. For years before departure, Mansa Musa prepared the pilgrimage with a meticulousness that reflected both his religious devotion and his sense of imperial theater. What he prepared is almost incomprehensible. 60,000 people in the caravan. Not just soldiers and servants, but a complete court. Scribes, physicians, theology teachers, poets, musicians, architects, cooks, merchants. 12,000 slaves, each dressed in silk and brocade, each carrying a 4-kilogram gold bar. 500 handmaids of Mansa Musa's wife herself, Inari Kunate, who also made the pilgrimage, and who traveled in such luxury that it would have scandalized the European courts of the time. 80 camels, each carrying between 100 and 135 kilograms of gold dust, horses with gold bridles, silk tents, mobile kitchens that prepared nocturnal feasts, and one rule: any person who asked the emperor for alms would receive gold. Any village the caravan passed through would receive gifts. Any mosque along the route would receive donations. Generosity had no limits, because the gold seemed to have no limits. Think about the logistics of this. 60,000 people need to eat, to drink, to sleep, to move. In an era without trains, without buses, without modern supply systems, through the most hostile desert in the world, every day of the pilgrimage required organizing the feeding of an entire city in motion through sand and scorching heat. The field kitchens worked before dawn to prepare breakfast. Water carriers moved through the caravan distributing water from leather gourds. Physicians treated the inevitable cases of heat stroke, infection, camel injuries. The animals needed pasture and water at calculated points along the route. Horses were more demanding than camels, and there were hundreds of horses. And despite all of this, the caravan moved through the Sahara, month after month, because Mansa Musa had the resources to organize the impossible. The route was carefully chosen. From Mali, the caravan departed northeast, crossing the Sahara Desert, one of the most difficult journeys in the medieval world. For months, it passed through Timbuktu, through Gao, through Tagaza, the salt mines in the heart of the desert, where workers lived in houses made of salt blocks because it was the only material available. At each stop, Mansa Musa built, financed repairs to mosques, paid theology teachers to teach in the communities he passed through. It was not just a pilgrimage. It was a royal tour through the Islamic world. It arrived in Egypt from the southwest, and it was in Egypt that the history of the world changed. The arrival in Cairo, the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Nasir Mohammed, sent representatives to receive Mansa Musa with imperial honors. Protocol required that Mansa Musa, upon being received by the Sultan, prostrate himself, a sign of submission and respect. Mansa Musa refused, not out of arrogance, but out of religious principle. As a devout Muslim, he only prostrated before God, not before any man, whoever he might be. There were delicate diplomatic negotiations. Finally, they reached a compromise. Mansa Musa would bow rather than prostrate, a matter of honor preserved on both sides. And when they finally met, the Sultan of Egypt and the Emperor of Mali, what Mansa Musa did next initiated the economic collapse. He began to distribute gold, not in a calculated way, not in a strategic way, in an absolutely casual way, as if gold were infinite, as if wealth were not a limited resource, but a permanent state of being. He gave gold to members of the Egyptian court. He gave gold to officials who accompanied him to market. He gave gold to beggars in the streets. He gave gold to every person he met who seemed to be in need. When someone did him a service, however minor, they received gold as payment. When he visited markets, and he visited many, with the genuine curiosity of a man who wanted to know the world, he paid for everything with gold, and left as change the equivalent of what he paid. And when he visited mosques, which he did in every Egyptian city he crossed, he donated gold for their construction and maintenance in quantities that left religious administrators astonished. The economic collapse. Here is what makes this story truly extraordinary. The quantity of gold that Mansa Musa introduced into the Cairo economy, and then into Syria and the rest of the Middle East, was so vast that the price of gold collapsed. The medieval economy depended on the scarcity of precious metals to maintain their value. Gold was valuable because there was little of it. Mansa Musa introduced so much gold at once that the market could not absorb it. The price of gold in Cairo fell 25% during his visit. To understand the dimension of this, a 25% fall in the price of gold means that everyone who had savings in gold lost a quarter of their value, that all commercial contracts denominated in gold were immediately unbalanced, that the entire gold-based economy entered instability, and it didn't recover immediately. 12 years later, historians were still documenting the effects of Mansa Musa's visit on the regional economy. 12 years of economic disruption caused by a single visit. By a single man who was simply too rich to understand what he was doing. The historian Al-Makrizi, writing decades later, documented the phenomenon with astonishment. This man flooded Cairo with his generosity. There was no court official, no office holder who had not received gold from his hands. And then he added something that reveals the scale of the economic disaster. Prices rose to such an extent that even today merchants suffer the consequences. One man, one journey, and the economy of 3 continents was never the same. After Cairo, Mansa Musa continued his pilgrimage to Mecca. The journey through the Arabian Peninsula was more discreet than the entrance into Cairo, but no less impressive. He visited Medina. He visited the holy sites of Islam with the genuine devotion of a believer. And when he finally arrived in Mecca and completed the Hajj, the ritual that every devout Muslim aspires to fulfill at least once in their life, he did so with a pomp that no other pilgrim had equaled, and that probably no other would equal. But there was a problem, the problem of gold. Mansa Musa had distributed so much gold during the journey that when he arrived in Mecca, he began to run short of liquid reserves for the practical costs of the pilgrimage. This is one of the most human and fascinating moments in his story. The richest man in the world, at the holiest site in the Islamic world, running out of pocket money. The solution was typically Mansa Musa. He borrowed. From merchants and moneylenders in Mecca, he borrowed at interest rates, something that was technically in conflict with Islamic law, but which practical necessity justified. And when he returned to Mali, with a detour through Cairo to buy works of art, hire architects and academics, and acquire luxury goods, he paid all the loans with generous interest, which means that the economic impact of his journey included not only the gold he distributed, but also the loans he contracted and then paid off, injecting even more gold into the regional economy. The return and the guests. The most important thing that Mansa Musa brought back to Mali was not gold or luxury goods, it was people. Specifically, he brought Abu Ishaq Ibrahim al-Sahili, a poet and architect from Granada in southern Spain. Al-Sahili was a cultured, sophisticated man with advanced Islamic training and knowledge of architecture that was rare in West Africa. Mansa Musa convinced him to return with him to Mali. With what argument? With 200 kilograms of gold as an advance payment. And Al-Sahili transformed the architecture of the Sahel. The mosques he built in Timbuktu, and that his disciples continued to build, are an extraordinary fusion of Andalusian and Islamic influences with local mud construction techniques. The result is a completely unique architectural style, the famous mud mosques of Mali, with their conical towers covered with protruding wooden poles, including the Jingweraba Mosque, built directly under Al-Sahili's supervision in 1327, which still exists today, still functions, still considered one of the greatest monuments of Islamic architecture in Africa. 700 years. The mosque that the architect brought by Mansa Musa built still stands. There is a place in the world whose fame is inversely proportional to the knowledge people have of Timbuktu. Everyone has heard the name. It is synonymous with the end of the world, a place so remote it is almost mythological. But during the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu was exactly the opposite of remote. It was the center of the world, the city, located at the point where the Niger River makes its great southward curve before plunging toward the Gulf of Guinea. Timbuktu was the convergence node of 2 of the greatest trade networks of the medieval world. The trans-Saharan caravans that brought salt from the north, the Niger canoes that brought gold from the south. At their intersection, Timbuktu. During the 14th and 15th centuries, Timbuktu had a population of 100,000 people. For context, London at that time had perhaps 50,000. Paris perhaps 80,000. Timbuktu was larger than most European cities of its era, and it was rich in a way that went far beyond gold and salt. The Sankore University, under Mansa Musa, and with the resources and prestige that his pilgrimage generated, Timbuktu became a center of Islamic learning without parallel in West Africa. The Sankore University, which grew from a madrasa attached to the mosque of the same name, reached 25,000 students. 25,000 students at a time when Oxford University had perhaps 3,000. Islamic theology was taught, but also mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, rhetoric, philosophy, Arabic literature. Teachers came from across the Islamic world, from Egypt, Syria, Persia, Muslim Spain. And students came equally from North Africa, the Middle East, all of sub-Saharan Africa. But there was something fundamental that distinguished Sankore from many other medieval universities: the teaching method. At Sankore, students learned not only by memorizing texts, though memorization was important, but also through debate, questioning, critical analysis. Sankore's teachers were known for the depth of their knowledge and their willingness to discuss and debate difficult questions. Ahmed Baba, one of Timbuktu's most famous scholars, who lived between 1556 and 1627, wrote more than 40 works on different aspects of Islamic law, theology, and history. When Moroccan conquerors took Timbuktu in 1591 and took Ahmed Baba as a prisoner to Morocco, he arrived in Morocco, and the local academic community was so impressed by his knowledge that they asked the Sultan to let him teach. A prisoner, captured in war, recognized by his captors as one of the greatest scholars in the Islamic world. Such was the academic level that Timbuktu had achieved. Timbuktu was, during its centuries of glory, what Alexandria had been for the ancient world, the place where knowledge converged. The manuscripts. And here is perhaps the most extraordinary and most underestimated aspect of Timbuktu's heritage: the manuscripts. In 1998, researchers began to systematically catalogue the manuscripts that survived in the private libraries of Timbuktu, many of them hidden for centuries to protect them from invaders. What they found left the academic world astonished. Current estimates suggest there are between 300,000 and 700,000 manuscripts in Timbuktu and surrounding regions. 300,000 to 700,000 medieval manuscripts
of the movements of the stars
in Arabic,
with great precision.
in local languages using the Arabic
preserved
alphabet.
here is unmatched
Some of them
in the Western
unique in
lands.
the world. They cover topics ranging from astronomy to medicine, from mathematics to history, from poetry to Islamic jurisprudence. There are astronomical treatises showing knowledge of the solar system that Europe would not achieve for another century. There are medical manuals describing surgical procedures with remarkable sophistication. There are histories of West African civilizations written by people who lived in them, not by external observers. There are mathematical works demonstrating knowledge of advanced algebra and geometry. And there are, fascinatingly, texts on medicine that describe treatments for diseases based on careful empirical observation. Not magic, not superstition. Careful observation and systematic recording. They are the Alexandria that survived, the library that fire did not reach because it was hidden in the desert, in private libraries, protected by families who understood its value. In 2012, when extremists from the Ansar Dine group took Timbuktu, they tried to destroy these manuscripts, just as Theophilus had destroyed the Serapeum of Alexandria. But this time, there was a difference. The families of Timbuktu, warned in advance, organized an extraordinary evacuation operation. In cargo vans, in boats on the Niger River, hidden in grain sacks and in dried fish crates, tens of thousands of manuscripts were transported to Bamako, the capital of Mali, before the extremists could destroy them. A cultural resistance operation that saved a crucial part of humanity's historical record. Just as the inhabitants of Timbuktu had for centuries hidden manuscripts from invaders, modern families did the same. The memory of how to protect knowledge was transmitted from generation to generation, and it worked. In 1375, a Jewish cartographer from the island of Majorca named Abraham Cresques completed what would be considered the most advanced map of the medieval world, the Catalan Atlas, an extraordinarily detailed representation of the known world from Europe to the Far East, from Africa to the Silk Routes. And at the center of the map, in the heart of West Africa, a figure appears. A king, seated on a golden throne, holding in one hand a scepter and in the other a gold nugget the size of a melon. The legend beside him identifies him. Musa Mali, Lord of the Blacks of Guinea, whose country is so rich in gold that he is the richest and most noble lord of this part of the world. Mansa Musa, on the most important map of the 14th century, recognized by European cartographers who had never seen him personally as the richest man in the world, because his fame had reached Europe. The collapse of the gold price in Cairo in 1324 was felt in the markets of Alexandria, Genoa, Barcelona, Lisbon. European merchants knew that something extraordinary had happened in Egypt. They knew there was an empire in West Africa of incomprehensible wealth. And some, very few, began to think about how to get there. The connection with the Age of Discovery. Here is something rarely discussed in Portuguese and Spanish history books. One of the main motivations for Portuguese explorations of the African coast in the 15th century was to find the overland route to Mali, to the gold of Mansa Musa and his successors. Prince Henry the Navigator sponsored expeditions along the African coast, partly to find direct access to the gold trade that the Moors controlled through the Sahara. The Portuguese wanted to eliminate the Islamic middleman and reach directly the source of African gold. In a sense, the Age of Discovery was motivated in part by the memory of Mansa Musa. The fame of an African emperor, dead decades before, inspired the expeditions that would end up circumnavigating the world. It is an extraordinary historical irony. The European exploration of Africa began as an attempt to reach African wealth and ended up destroying the civilizations it wanted to find. Mansa Musa died in 1337, perhaps. The sources are not completely clear about the date. What is clear is that with his death, the Mali Empire began a slow but irreversible decline. The collapse. Empires, like ecosystems, are more fragile than they appear. Mali depended on a delicate balance: control of trade routes, loyalty of provincial governors, and the personal authority of the Mansa to keep together a vast and diverse territory. When Mansa Musa died, his successors were progressively weaker. Wars of succession weakened the center. Provincial governors became independent. Trade routes were disrupted. In 1431, the Tuareg captured Timbuktu. In 1468, the Songhai Empire, which had been a vassal of Mali, took Timbuktu and expanded to become the new dominant power in West Africa. Mali didn't disappear immediately. A reduced kingdom survived until the 17th century. But the empire that Mansa Musa had governed was a shadow of what it had been, the erasure. But what happened to the Mali Empire was more than a natural political decline. It was a deliberate erasure. When Europeans began to write the history of the world, and especially when European colonialism in Africa reached its peak in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was an ideological need to present Africa as a continent without history, without civilization, without achievement. Because if Africa had had empires larger than any European medieval kingdom, if it had had universities when Europe was living in darkness, if it had produced the richest man in history, then the narrative that justified slavery and colonialism became much harder to sustain. And so the Arab chroniclers who documented Mali were ignored. The manuscripts of Timbuktu were dismissed as legends. The Manden Charter was erased from the history of human rights. Mansa Musa, the man whose portrait appeared on the most important map of the 14th century, became a footnote, or disappeared completely. In recent decades, African, Arab and some Western historians have been working to recover this history. The Manden Charter was inscribed on the UNESCO Intangible Cultural Heritage List in 2009. The Timbuktu manuscripts are being digitized, which means that even if the physical original is destroyed, the content will survive. And Mansa Musa has gradually returned to public consciousness, first in academic articles, then in lists of the richest in history, and more recently in references in popular culture. But the complete story, the context, the Mali Empire, the Manden Charter, the Sankore University, the Timbuktu manuscripts, is still largely unknown. So what do we do with this story? with the story of an empire that was larger than anything medieval Europe produced, of a man who was richer than anyone alive today, of a university that had more students than Oxford, of manuscripts that preserved knowledge the world almost lost. We do what we should always do with erased history. We recover it, not out of nostalgia, not out of politics, but because an honest understanding of the past is the only solid foundation for any honest vision of the present. The lie that sustains other lies, the idea that Africa had no history before the arrival of Europeans, is not just historically wrong, it is the foundation of an entire edifice of other lies. If Africa had no civilization, then slavery was less horrible. It was taking people from a primitive state to the benefits of European civilization. If Africa had no history, then colonialism was less destructive. There was less to destroy. If Africa had no achievement, then the current poverty of many African countries is a natural condition, not the result of centuries of systematic extraction of human and material resources. Each of these conclusions is false, and the falsehood begins with the erasure of Mansa Musa, the Manden Charter, the Sankore University, to the Timbuktu manuscripts. What the manuscripts say, here is something concrete that the Timbuktu manuscripts reveal, and that continues to surprise the academics who study them. There are astronomical treatises that describe planetary movements with precision that rivaled the best Arab astronomers of the time. There are medical manuals that describe surgical techniques and treatments for diseases with a solid empirical basis. There are mathematical texts that demonstrate knowledge of advanced algebra. There are historical works that document Mali and its predecessors with a detail that no external source can match. And there are, fascinatingly, texts on law and governance that reflect the principles of the Manden Charter, the idea that power has limits, that rulers have responsibilities toward the governed, that certain fundamental freedoms are inviolable. These are not primitive texts. They are works of a mature, sophisticated civilization that had thought deeply about how to organize human life together. In 1324, a man crossed the world's most hostile desert with 60,000 people and so much gold that he collapsed the economies of 3 continents. The world knew his name that year. European cartographers painted his portrait on their maps. Venetian merchants mentioned him in their commercial letters. Arab historians wrote about him with admiration. And then, gradually, the world forgot. Not by accident, by convenience. Because remembering Mansa Musa meant remembering the Mali Empire. And remembering the Mali Empire meant remembering that Africa had been great before becoming a colony. That Africa had had universities before Europe tried to prohibit the education of Africans. That Africa had had a human rights document before any European declaration. That memory was inconvenient, and so it was erased. But the memory survived. In the stories that Mali's families tell about Sundiata, in the manuscripts that Timbuktu's families hid in boxes buried in the desert to protect them from invaders, in the Jingwereba mosque that Al-Sahili built in 1327, and that still stands today, still calling the faithful to prayer. The memory survived because there were people who understood its value, who understood that a civilization that forgets its history loses more than the past. It loses the capacity to imagine its own future. Mansa Musa was the Lion of Mali, the richest man who ever existed, the emperor of a civilization that the world chose to forget. But forgetting is not permanent. History, like truth, has an irritating tendency to survive, hidden in manuscripts, preserved in oral traditions, carved in stone in the mosques that still rise in the desert, waiting for the day when someone stops looking only at the horizon they were taught to see and begins to look at the horizon that real history shows. Subscribe, because the story doesn't end here.